All right. Um, the the book that I want to read to you tonight, read parts of, is Temporary Planets for Transitory Days. Now, what this is a collection of poetry written by a man named Mykol Ranglen, who is the protagonist of my two previous science fiction novels, The Man Who Loved Alien Landscapes, and the man who did love alien landscapes is Mykol Ranglen, of course, and the novel In a Suspect Universe. In fact, there are a number of connections, direct connections between the poems in here and this particular novel. So what you have here is a work of fiction that's by a work of fiction. Mykol Ranglen himself is an interstellar space traveler, adventurer. He's also a writer and a poet. But one characteristic of Ranglen is that he's very private. He doesn't talk about himself very much. He doesn't reveal much about himself. The poetry that he writes and publishes is very formal and literary. But, and this is mentioned in this particular book, in fact, it's a plot point in the book, he keeps a notebook. And in the notebook are his private poems, the poems he doesn't share with anybody. Okay. And these are just jottings that he's done over the years. Well, it so happens this book is that notebook. It was published by Ranglen when he decided that it just might be time to let go of these poems, to move on. But they don't fit his standard works at all because they are rather personal. So they refer to what? The dreams, the secrets, the hopes, the dreams, the passions, the desires, the longings, his universe, the things that he has experienced, the things that he has encountered, that have impressed him enough that he wrote a poem about them. For example, there's a scene in a Suspect Universe where he and a woman called Mylea that he is falling in love with, and they're flying in an air car and they land beside a frozen lake, which is totally isolated. And they're enjoying the scene, watching the clouds, the aurora, the snow falling, and they wind up kissing each other. And this is the poem that he wrote about that particular scene. And this gives you an example of the connections, the few connections. There aren't too many poems in a book that do this, but how they are related to some of the incidents in his life. The title of the poem is As It Fell. At night, in the snow, by her powered-down, dim-lit air car, she stands. Call her up, lips calm, and she stares into the fragments of the healing sky. White condensation from a ceiling black. And she thinks, does the universe reach down to her, stare at her in wonder as she looks back in awe? Can she find only visions of galactic indifference, or gift chandeliers for our soul illumination? Are the glints in her eyes only reflections, like fallen stars in tiny human seas, or signals of a higher intellect's grace? Does the vast dark find her pensive look as haunting as I, for instance, do? Does it know a similar tender ache when the snowdrops pool in globules on her lips, on the moist, ripe crescents of her lips? Is longing interstellar? Is she loved by the sky as she is loved by me? I don't know. I just watch her in the snow, and I alone get to notice that the flakes falling there make white constellations in her midnight hair. The collection of poetry is organized into sections. The first section is called Nights on Alkira, and these refer to some specific and some not so specific at all incidents from In a Suspect Universe. The name of the planet that he's on in that novel is called Alkira. The second section is called Rocket Punk, and it deals with a kind of celebration of how we felt about space travel in the past. He's talking like the period of the 20th century, when we really believed in space travel coming, when it hadn't fully arrived yet. And if you know the pop culture from that time, you might recognize some of the references here. This is him talking about that era and comparing it to his own. That's what he's trying to do, because he wants to take the promise of that era and apply it to his own period of history. This is called The Universe in a Frame. Tom Corbett, from the control deck of his Polaris spaceship, observes stars through a round window nearly his height and cleverly encircled by pill shapes of glass. Rocky Jones, with his visiscreened bulkhead, made viewing the cosmos as easy and controlled as flipping TV channels, once the negative image was reversed. And in The Forbidden Planet, a simulacrum of outer space came locked inside a plexiglass sphere sitting in the center of the pilot's round table, reproducing exteriors with small lights and a tilted toy-like model of the ship. Thus, foreign majesty often contained, restricted by limits rectangular or round. Even their cinemascope came in a letterbox, and Panavision narrowed that width even more. The great unbridled galactic surround was encountered in flat geometric screens. It made a confining, a domestic sublime. They did see the universe, but only in a frame. If the emotional goal of space travel is wonder, awe, reverence, surprise, transformation, then such imposition of enlightenment margins could only hamper boundless sensations, restrict the majestic, clog the undefined. How is one transported through tiny scratched windows, soar and seek beyond the infinite in merely a few centimeters of screen? How do you smash all comprehension, break free of the box, leap one step beyond, when heads-up displays classify infinity, and when just seeing vastness imposes immediate self-definition? They surely craved more. They had to have been like us. They too must have asked, how can one astonish, break common sense, ruin suspension, affront comprehension, and deliver grandeur in something else than a cage? We acknowledge the universe. We catalog and define. We admire its beauty, but we want the sublime. The next section in the book basically it's called Planetary Romance, and it deals with some of the loves that he's had in his life, especially the two in the two novels that were written. This one, I don't know if this deals with anybody in his life or not. It sounds more like the beginning of a fantasy story, the possibility for a fantasy story. I don't know. In later novels, I might make some kind of connection. We'll see. But I thought I'd read this one. It's called The Woman in the Tree. It was inspired by a painting by Segantini, I believe. I could be wrong about that. As night fell and winds rose, I heard a tragic siren call. I raced from my hut to the ocean cliff, where I saw a white, translucent glow, impaled, entwined in a bare-branched tree, a soft creature in black moon dark, delicate, captive, close-knifed by the limbs, half unformed, indeterminate life, with features in flux and face in pain. A childlike wraith, a creature of the wind, snagged, unfree, flailing with need against the confining, clutching embrace of this spindly witch's wooden claw. And I, caring, plucked at the bonds, disengaged the white wrap, tugged and yanked until I held the woman in the tree. She had called. I came to this elf, spirit, transient of the storm, so thin of substance, so freed of weight, so filled with desire that screamed in her sharp and determined eyes, that begged to be onward, to leave, to soar. Her pale arm pointed the way. Her long hair lined the wind with black. And thus, in seeing such need, such longing, I let her go. Let be. Let fly. The buoyant air drew her swiftly off. Her shrinking, pale, luminescent bounced in the torrent, withdrew, disappeared. The sea tossed. The sky closed. Alone I stood on that cliff, unmoving, throughout the long and emptied night, till dawn's indifferent and pale light came, and bleak day. The next section is called Tales of Old Earth, and in this I deal with some scenes on Earth like Las Vegas and Death Valley, and some of its popular culture. There are poems called Black Canary's Blue Song, What Flash Gordon Said to Dale Arden, Wonder Woman Speaks to Superman. But I'm going to read a brief poem called Nosferatu. When you look at the earlier history of Dracula, Dracula was not a very appealing person at all. The whole romantic atmosphere that you get later wasn't there. And if you've seen that early movie called Nosferatu, Dracula looks like a demonic elf, okay? He's not very, you don't want to get near him at all. And that's what this poem is about. Nosferatu. Your nails are too long. Your teeth are too bright. Your hunchbacked shadow falls blacker than midnight. Stand off from bloodlust. Trade red eyes for blue. Find another or any life. Nosferatu. Your ears are too sharp. Your mouth's made of fangs. Your hands are like spiders. Your eyebrows overhang. Discard your immortality. It's what you ought to do. For saving you gets harder. Nosferatu. The hardest thing about that poem was finding a rhyme for Nosferatu. There's another section in here called Riley's World. In A Suspect Universe, Mykol meets a woman named Riley. It's not the one that he falls madly in love with, but it's the person he kind of feels right at the end of the book, oh, maybe I should have fallen in love with her. And she literally is separated from him in another universe, of all things. So he never has a chance of getting with her again. But he imagines a life for her. And he imagines her having a child, and the child is named Abby. And the interesting thing about this, although he feels he's imagining all this, just creating this life for her, it actually, we see a little bit of her life right at the end of the book, and it actually does tally up a little bit. There is a child in there named Abby. The name is spelled differently. So there's a slight little indication here that you didn't get in the novel, but you get it here in this book, that there might be some kind of leakage between the universes, and Ranglen just might be picking it up, okay? So he's talking about this child as she's growing up. And this particular poem is called Abby at 3 years old. We're not as often under the table, but drawing is now appealing again. She can recognize her name, and she wanted to know what a spiral was. Abby days. She still loves the crystals. We spill them on the floor and group them by type. And green ones, and there's a yellow cat's eye. She speaks in such crescendos of excitement. Then her foot in the middle scrambles the symmetry. With prisms, we fling rainbows on the walls or ourselves, make her toes into glowing little toy crayons. We blow bubbles and pester them till they splatter against us in soapy wet surprise. Small sensory wonders. When she's tired, she withdraws behind sad, whiny tears. Everything is no, or I don't want to. The universe seems wrong to her, and you want to change it, knowing that you can't. She loves Nana's ivory lace dress. A lady in appearance, she races unladylike to seek hidden Riley. And finding her, she screams in absolute joy. Hide again, she yells. It's a common response. I read her a book. She says, read it again. We watch a video, and let's watch it again. Plus, she's in that why stage. She takes every answer and makes it another question. What comes after 15? 16, I say. Then what comes after 16? She leads me by my finger from room to room. I'm a captivated captive. She sits among pennies and holds them between her toes. I tell her, Piggy's Bank. All simple pleasures, but uniquely cherished. In moments so rich and overwhelming for me, wonderful days. Abby 3. The last section of the book, I'm skipping one here, running out of time, is called Sanctuary. And it's where Ranglen kind of comes to grips with his past and writes some poems very directly about things in his early life, things in his current life. This one deals with a moment in his childhood, basically, where he would hear outside his window bats flying at night. And bats, send out sonar sounds, basically, so that they can see by the echoes coming back from the buildings. And he could hear this. So he wrote a poem about it that is called The Secret Identity. Not Clark Kent, nor Superman neither, but a latent dark bat of the soul, flying by radar's insubstantial pulse and groping, desperate, seeking in code, beyond all longing, but hinting, reminding that at the center of self is this other secret self, this mysterious, mutated, darkened bird, this tiny storm of determined desire that must reach without hands, see without eyes, fly alone, apart, withdrawn, to endure. And I remember when young, awaking at night and staring through empty windows of darkness and thinking in silent, frustrated need, as if losing the end of some wondrous dream. I want, or more often, I love, but not knowing where or why or what. Just filled with a wild, unguided affection, a haunted craving or furious surmise. And I'd think of Bruce Wayne, a rodent that smashed his window and told him, showed him his secret self. You're Batman, my friend. I'm in you forever. And I, a pessimist even when young, wondered if someday, somehow, just maybe, I too would be able to name this longing, bring home this fleet, unknown fury, this embracing without sight, this wildness, this need. And thus now, after long years, as I hear bat squeals echo along roofs and walls outside, as they speak to me in ciphers and fragments from the dark, in the fugitive screams and whispers of sight, I realize, I know the secret of identity that to our window night brings. Our longing is blind, but our longing has wings. The poems in this section are definitely his most private and personal poems. And this is the last one that I'm going to read here. It's called A Confession, and it obviously is that because I cannot imagine Ranglen saying something like this ever to another person. I might write it, but this really is a revelation from him, okay? But it tells you something about him very deep inside. Once, I considered writing a children's book in which a kind uncle asked a loved child, "What's the nicest word you can think of?" She'd suggest possibilities. Candy, play, friends. He'd say, no. Home, pets, family. Still, no. trees, the sea, the stars. Not close. She'd begged to be enlightened. He'd claimed that her knowing the word should be easy, that it covers everything, applies to each person, event, possibility. Tell me, she'd insist. And he'd say, as if obvious, the nicest word in the language is you. And thus, all in all, to be sure, to be true, each poem I ever wrote was the poem of you. There. Thank you for listening.